Joining us now to analyze today's breaking news headlines is Rahul Mahajan. He is an author and a sociologist. His book is called Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
Well, 6 prisoners who have spent years in the U.S.-run Guantanamo Bay Detention Center finally left their prison this weekend. But they weren't going home. They were being transferred to Uruguay and are technically free. 4 of the men are Syrian, 1 is Tunisian, and 1 is Palestinian. Uruguayan President Jose Mujica referred to the men as, quote, humans suffering a heinous kidnapping in Guantanamo, and that Uruguay was playing a role in helping return them to their homes for, quote, humanitarian reasons. The men are now designated as refugees and are under the auspices of the UN Agency for Refugees. 136 men remain imprisoned at Guantanamo. That's down from more than 750 that were originally imprisoned by the Bush administration in the years following the September 11th attacks. Now, Rahul, do you know if these men will ever get to go home? And if the U.S. kidnapped them and imprisoned them for more than a decade, why isn't it simply repatriating them to their homes?
Well, you know, it's very hard to say what's going to end up happening to them. I mean, well over 100 Guantanamo prisoners have been transferred to countries that were not, you know, their homes. And, you know, in the case of the Syrians in particular, getting going home now is fraught with all kinds of other dangers. I think there are several reasons why this kind of thing happens with the Guantanamo prisoners. In some cases, the prisoners themselves do not want to be returned to their homes because they're afraid that they'll be under threat of violence. This is true especially for those who had, like many of them, had nothing to do with any kind of jihadi groups or terrorist attacks or anything like that. Another reason is that there are times when the United States is ready to let them go but doesn't want them to go to their home country because they think that there's too much unrest and the likelihood of their becoming, anti-U.S. Fighters is too high. And a third is, 4 of these guys are Syrian. A third is the United States doesn't have diplomatic relations with some of these countries, and so they have to go through a complicated rigmarole.
And then whistleblower Chelsea Manning, who is imprisoned for releasing troves of information about how the U.S. conducted the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, published a bold op-ed in the Guardian newspaper this morning. In it, the soldier formerly known as Bradley Manning made the case that transgender people like her constantly have their rights violated. Using her own case to illustrate the point, she wrote, quote, a doctor, a judge, or a piece of paper shouldn't have the power to tell someone who he or she is. We should all have the absolute and inalienable right to define ourselves. Manning also drew attention to the fact that low-income transgender people of color in particular face greater barriers and that her fight was part of a larger struggle for civil rights. Now, Rahul, Chelsea Manning doesn't seem to have let being in prison silence her. How important is it for us to hear from her?
Well, I think it's important. She's a voice of conscience and really a prisoner of conscience. And so it's important to hear from people like that regularly because there's so few in the public sphere that one does hear from. It's also, I think, in the case of somebody like her who is in terrible conditions and is in for a very long time, it's also important to be able to keep tabs on the sanity and mental health of the person, and the fact that she is continuing to write about a variety of political issues is certainly a positive sign there.
And finally, in what seems to be a turning point for the mass movement in Mexico, sparked by 43 missing students, remains of the first student have been identified and his death confirmed. The parents of 19-year-old Alexander Mora are in mourning, joined by many Mexicans across the country. It is now also confirmed that Mora's body was incinerated and dumped into a river. The confirmed death makes it more likely that the other 42 students suffered a similar fate. Dozens of people have already been arrested in connection with the crime, which has posed the biggest threat to President Enrique Peña Nieto's tenure. Now, Rahul, people have fixated on the fate of these specific 43 students, but 100,000 people have been killed in gang-related violence in Mexico since 2007. It's really about that, isn't it?
Well, I think it's really about both things. I mean, on the one hand, had it not been for this incredible background of violence by drug gangs, and by drug gangs often in collusion with parts of the local state, there wouldn't have been this sort of massive upwelling after the initial local protest, the fact that tens of thousands marched in Mexico City and so on, and the fact that it's actually endangering the government. On the other hand, it's very difficult to protest against something as big and as diffuse as this atmosphere of violence that has led to so many deaths over many years. So this was a very egregious case. 43 students from one college. I mean, even drug gangs rarely massacre such a large number of people who are unrelated to their enterprise in any way. With the
Right.
overt collusion of local authorities, I think that's what made it this a real flashpoint.
Rahul, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
See you then.
Rahul Mahajan is a sociologist and news analyst and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. And in Los Angeles news, a massive fire in downtown Los Angeles that's being dubbed historic is finally under control. Hundreds of firefighters battled an inferno that claimed several buildings and shut down freeways. There were no injuries, and the cause of the fire is still unknown. This is Uprising. We'll be right back.